It is cruel for the old to inflict their disillusioned wisdom on the young. Fortunately, it is also impossible.
Irving was a naughty old scamp. He was very fond of attacking people in public, but he was invariably nice to them in private. So there was a lot of that mask thing that went on. I first saw him read in 1960, and I would say I and Gwendolyn McEwen were probably the only female poets of that particular generation, and Irving did the same thing to both of us. And here is what he did. He came to our readings, both of us. He sat at the back, both of us, and he went to sleep. Both of us, and snored. But ostentatiously through our readings. At the end of our readings, both of us, he said, "Well, you may be a good poet, but you're a terrible reader. You put me to sleep." Yes, I wish he were with us today, because I'm about to read his poem called Berry Picking, and I hope it does not put you to sleep. I first read this poem, I believe, in the Tamarack Review, and was very struck by it. And I have to say at this point that Irving, when he was good, was very, very good. Let us say that right now. And indeed, I said that in the Oxford Book of Canadian Poetry of 1983 that I put together. You can read all of the nice things I said about Irving as a poet. Not as a snorer. I hope I can do this justice. Berry picking. Silently my wife walks on the still wet furze. Now dark green, the leaves are full of metaphors. Now lit up is each tiny lamp of blueberry. The white nails of rain have dropped, and the sun is free. And whether she bends or straightens to each bush to find the children's laughter among the leaves, her quiet hands seem to make the quiet summer hush. Berries or children, patient she is with these. I only vex and perplex her. Madness, rage, or endearing, perhaps, put down upon the page. Even silence day-long and sullen can then enamor as restraint or classic discipline. So I envy the berries she puts into her mouth, the red and succulent juice that stains her lips. I shall never taste that good to her, nor will they displease her with 1,000 barbarous jests. How they lie easily for her hand to take, part of the unoffending world that is hers. Here, beyond complexity, she stands and stares and leans her marvelous head as if for answers. No more the easy soul my childish craft deceives, nor the simpler one for whom yes is always yes. No, now her voice comes to me from a far way off, though her lips are redder than the raspberries. Thank you.
Man is absurd, not because he kills and couples, but because he feels obliged to invent reasons for doing so.
My thought is that the small contribution that I can make to tonight's proceedings is to remind everybody that Irving was also an earthy man, often a body man, who reacquainted Canadian poetry with its own genitals, and who thought that life was essentially, and this I quote, a Dionysian private parts affair with time off for meditation and good works. Now, unlike most people here, I was not an adult when I first became acquainted with Irving, but a kid. He bounded into our class and into my life. First day of the new school year at Herzliya Junior High in Montreal. It's the mid-1950s, and I'm 12. Canada has just come out of the Second World War with its world standing considerably enhanced, and its culture poised to shake off the dust of mediocrity and colonialism, and leading the charge in a world of poetry is none other than Irving Layton, gadfly provocateur, who by virtue of the post-war McCarthy chill finds himself making a living as a class teacher in an obscure parochial school devoted to the preservation of Jewish culture and history after the Holocaust. But all that is something that I learned subsequently. In the moment, all I knew was that Mr. Layton was some kind of a modern poet, which seemed to mean mostly that the lines didn't rhyme. And he got to use a lot of forbidden words. And thus it was that the words breast, buttocks, and phallus came into my vocabulary. And it's from that point of view of an amazed but entirely willing young boy and later young man that I would like to read you these few poems. The first one's called Misunderstanding. I placed my hand upon her thigh. By the way she moved away, I could see that her devotion to literature was not perfect. There were two abiding campaigns that Irving fought with unrelenting vigor all the days of his life. The first was against Canadian Philistinism, and the second was against Canadian Puritanism. But I think he did all of that with a bit of an impish grin, and behind it all was an abiding love of women. He had a long life's worth of eye for the girls, and he spent a good deal of his energy and a good deal of his lucre dealing with the exquisite complications that that pursuit inevitably led to. This one's called Bargain. In 14 years of married bliss, not once have I been disloyal to my wife, and you, I hear, are still a virgin. If you are set to barter your maidenhead for my unheard of fidelity, call me between 3 and 5 tomorrow. And it is done. So finally we come to my third selection, which is a product of his more mature years. But by that time I'd come to understand that Irving's importance was not only as an energetic and inspiring teacher, but as the acknowledged showman, leader of an important movement, not only in Canadian letters, but in world letters. And that meant, of course, that his seductions had to be carried out at a much more sophisticated, more international level. And so I give you Seduction of and by a Civilized French Woman. Having agreed that Simone de Beauvoir's feminism is a bad joke, that Sartre is a has-been and a stupid Jansenist muddlehead, that Camus possessed more integrity than talent, that there are no longer any poets in France worth mentioning, that much of the same could be said for her novelists, and that in general French culture is in a parlous condition, if not actually dead, not having cared to move a single centimeter beyond Flaubert and Valéry, and that no one except the two of us seem to know what is happening in that wretched country. Having agreed politely to disagree about Hemingway, Rimbaud, Hölderlin, Nietzsche, Brecht, Lawrence, Moravia, Jaspers, Kafka, Strindberg, and Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, having dismissed politics as a bêtise and religion as a folie, and having inevitably but cautiously left the high ground of literacy and philosophical discussion to speak of more personal, more mundane matters, i.e. one's dissatisfactions with conventional marriage, one's adulteries, fornications, venereal diseases, there were none. And given a description of the circumstances attendant on one's best and worst fucks, having slyly dropped 2 or 3 hints about one's favorite erogenous zones and the best means of stimulating them, and having led from this to the overriding paramount need in sex for tenderness, mutual esteem, humor, delicatesse, and for similar, though not necessarily identical, tastes in literature, music, philosophy, art, theater, and contemporary films, we are now ready to make love.
There is no force more subversive than poetry, and that is why tyrants have always feared it and sought to suppress it. But not only tyrants. Everyone who has a vested interest in preventing the individual from discovering the truth of his own self and his own capacities fears the liberating power that resides in poetry.
Poetry is as ancient as the spoken word. It's, I would say, it is an exquisite art form, damn difficult to write because it mirrors the full range of human experience with just a few words. Rilke once said, "Poetry is the past that breaks out in our hearts." Not all those who claim to be poets write it well, but Irving Layton was one. He was not just the bad boy of Canadian poetry, rebellious, iconoclastic, although he was that. He also had this ability to break the mold and yet have his poetry take flight. Poetry that breaks out in our hearts. And so, Max, it is entirely appropriate that you would have organized these celebrations in honor of your father's centenary. Now, because others have and will be reading his poetry, and because I never met Irving Layton, I thought I would recite a poem by another poet who carries the same sentiments as you do for your father. The poet is George Mackay Brown, and he writes about his father, who was a simple postman in the village of Hamnavoy in the Orkney Islands. And it goes something like this. My father passed with his penny letters through closes, opening and shutting like legends, when barbarous with gulls, Hamnavoy's morning broke on the salt and tar steps. Herring boats, puffing red sails, the tillers on cold horizons lean down the gull-gaunt tide and threw dark nets on sudden silver harvests. A cart horse at the sweet fountain dredged water and touched fire on steel-kissed cobbles. Hard on noon, 4 bearded merchants past the pipe-spitting pierhead strolled, rosy with greed, chanting their slow, grave jargon. A tinker keened like a tartan gull at queith-hung doors. The brass tongue of a bellman foretold coon concert, cargo of English coal. In the Arctic whaler, 3 blue elbows fell regular as waves, from beards spumy with porter, till the amber day ebbed out to its black dregs. Boats drove furrows homeward like ploughmen in blizzards of gulls. Gaelic fisher girls flashed knife and dirge over drifts of herring, and boys with their penny wands lured gleams from the tangled veins of the flood. Houses went blind up one steep close for a grief by the shrouded nets. The kirk, in a gale of psalms, went heaving through a tumult of roofs freighted for heaven. Ploughboy and milk-glass tarried under the buttered bannock of the moon. He quenched his lantern, leaving the last door. Because of his gay poverty that kept my sea-pink innocence from the worm and black wind, and because, under the equality of the sun, all things wear now to a common soiling, in the fire of images I gladly put my hand to save that day for him.